welcome to the ThoughtWorks Technology Podcast. My name is Alexei. I'm the head of technology for ThoughtWorks Brazil, and I will be one of your hosts this time together with Mike Mason. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Alexei. Happy to be here. My name's Mike. I'm also one of the regular podcast hosts.
And we're delighted to have Pete Hodgson with us this time. So, Pete, would you mind introducing yourself a little bit to our listeners?
Sure. Hello. My name is Pete, and I'm a software delivery consultant. So I used to be, I still am a software engineer, and I spent some time at startups, and then I spent some time at this global consulting company called ThoughtWorks. And then I went back to startups for a little bit, and now I'm doing independent consulting. And a lot of what I do is kind of helping teams get better at delivering software. So sometimes that's kind of architecture and stuff like that. But a lot of times it's also kind of around process and how to get stuff into production on a good cadence.
So Pete is a good friend of ThoughtWorks. Used to work with them very closely. Obviously, quite aligned with I would say ThoughtWorks' worldview on things, and the right way to build software. And today's episode is called Continuous Delivery in the Wild. And we're going to be talking to Pete about a recent ebook that he's written for O'Reilly, talking about continuous delivery. So Pete, why don't you tell us a little bit about the premise of this Continuous Delivery in the Wild book that you've written?
So I spend quite a lot of time talking to people about continuous delivery and hearing kind of thought leaders and stuff like that talking about continuous delivery. And what I notice is people spend a lot of time talking about kind of like the cutting edge stuff that like really advanced engineering orgs are doing, which I think is great. But I don't really hear that much being talked about kind of just companies that are just quietly doing this stuff well, and they might not necessarily be doing the most kind of amazing cutting edge practices, but they're succeeding really well, and they're kind of getting the value out of these kind of continuous delivery principles without necessarily doing all of the whizzy super fancy stuff that you'd go to a conference talk to hear about, although maybe you should be going to a conference talk to hear about the successful stuff. So kind of the premise was I want to kind of get real talk, not conference talks. And so a company called Split kind of sponsored this little project, and I went and found a bunch of organizations that were kind of succeeding in continuous delivery by my definition, where they were kind of releasing to production at least once a day, often more than that. So that was kind of the criteria. But besides that kind of criteria, the people I talked to were quite varied. So they were like big kind of like enterprisey companies, little startups, companies that had been around since the 50s, companies that had been around since like last year. So kind of a really wide kind of range of companies, but all of them, this kind of unifying thing where they're all doing pretty well with CD. And I just basically spent some time with a bunch of their teams saying, asking them how they did CD or how they did kind of software delivery.
So let's start with that definition of CD, because I think that's worth pushing on a little bit, because I think a lot of people would define it in different ways. So your definition for this is organizations that are able to deploy to production daily.
That was my criteria for companies that I feel like are succeeding with continuous delivery to some extent. The way I would define continuous delivery, and I feel nervous whenever I'm around kind of ThoughtWorks people, I always get a little bit more nervous about kind of sticking my neck out. Like my kind of working definition for continuous delivery is that you're able to release code from like your mainline branch, your master or your trunk or whatever, wherever you're releasing to production. You feel confident that at any time you could deploy from that code from master to production. That's like, to me, is the kind of the central thing. And there's a bunch of like principles and practices kind of that kind of mixed in there. But I think that's the key kind of thing to keep in. That's the definitional thing for me, I think, for continuous delivery.
Because I mean, I'm not an expert, but I feel like, when Jez and Dave were working on the original book, one of the key things was to make, the IT department not a blocker for getting a deployment out of the door. So it was to make, deployment or delivery of software to be a business decision rather than one that was mired in 3 months of getting it through the test environment or whatever. So in a lot of ways, it doesn't even need to be once a day. It just needs to be at will. You could do it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's totally true. There isn't anything in, definitely not as far as I'm aware, in that kind of original book. And I think really in the principles of continuous delivery, it's not about you must be able to deliver every X days. It is about the, I think particularly when it was first becoming popular, I think a lot of it was about exactly what you're saying, to kind of giving power back to kind of the product owner or whatever to release software at the pace that felt right. I think what's emerged is, and kind of a lot of the research that Nicole and Jez and Gene Kim did with the kind of amazing Accelerate book and the DevOps report. I think what has emerged is like the value. There's some value in kind of giving control back to product people, but I think there's this really like interesting. Maybe it was originally understood. Maybe it was by smart people. It's not intuitive to me, but there's this really interesting thing that like by compressing that feedback cycle, by allowing yourself to release more frequently, you end up releasing more frequently. And then you get these like really interesting effects around kind of reducing batch size and smaller changes going out. And I think that's like nowadays, I think there's some confusion, or at least there's some stuff gets mixed up in a lot of people's brains between kind of continuous delivery and continuous deployment, and this idea of like frequent releases, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's because people who are doing continuous delivery and have the capability to release whenever they want realize that using that capability to release a lot is really, really useful. And so they do it. And so people see, people who are doing continuous delivery are releasing all the time. So therefore continuous delivery is releasing all the time. And I don't think that's exactly right. I think it's actually about the capability to do that. And what ends up happening is most organizations do that because it's super valuable to be able to have small, rapid flow or a frequent flow of small changes into production is like super, super valuable. And that was definitely one of the things that when I was talking to these organizations as part of this book, the like super common theme was the value in reducing batch sizes.
Cool. Well, that's very useful. Thanks. So you did mention different companies you talk to, and that seems interesting to see all these patterns emerging in several different contexts and contrasting contexts. So were any patterns that you found over that research? Is there anything surprising or anything that you feel like sharing?
Yeah, I mean, I think what was interesting to me, kind of broadly, what was really interesting was that there was these kind of core principles that lots of organizations shared, but then the way they kind of applied those principles were quite varied. So like the key thing that I just kept on hearing was around this thing about reducing batch size, right? And kind of which essentially means kind of trying to get into a cadence of releasing frequently or deploying frequently, I guess. But the way that different types of organizations achieved that was really different, right? So taking that same principle of like, we want to be able to deploy frequently, but then looking at your architecture. So some of these organizations were, 2 years old and had, when they started building their systems, everyone was already all excited about fine-grained SOA or microservices, whatever you want to call it. So they had these kind of fine-grained systems, like loads of little independently deployable artifacts. And other organizations, for various reasons, had these ginormous monoliths or these largest monoliths that they're in the process of breaking down. So that kind of difference in architecture was reflected by a difference in like the way you do release management, for example. So there was this kind of pattern that I saw with more monolithic systems, and my kind of definition for a monolith from this, in terms of this research, is like a monolith is something where a deployable artifact is owned by more than one team, because I think that's actually the ergonomics is kind of that captures like what makes a monolith kind of different to work with. So people that were working in those architectures, it's not feasible. Like practices that work with microservices don't make sense in the context of that. So releasing let me take a step back. So if you've got a microservice-y architecture and each deployable artifact is generally owned by a single team, maybe let's say 7 engineers, it's actually feasible to just say an engineer writes the code and walks it all the way to prod. Like literally, like they make the commit or a series of commits, they get signed off or whatever, it's ready to go, it passes kind of quality checks, and that engineer walks those changes all the way to production. That's not really feasible to do with a monolithic system, because changes are landing so quickly because there's so many people making changes to the same deployable artifact. And the people making those changes are kind of far away from you organizationally, like they're not on the same team, so you don't necessarily know what those changes are. It's not feasible to just say like, oh, I'm just going to deploy the latest code. You can try it, but what I found from talking to these organizations is most people had realized at some point that that's not feasible. So then you kind of think like, well, how can we achieve the principles that we're going for here of releasing frequently, but in our context of we've got a large kind of like monolithic architecture, and the kind of the pattern that a lot of teams had kind of landed on is this idea of kind of like a release bus. So essentially a scheduled release that goes out let's say every day or twice a day or every couple of days maybe. I could go into the details of that specific pattern, but I think it's interesting more broadly to realize that the thing that works for some other company X, just because they're succeeding with it doesn't mean it's going to necessarily work in your organization. Like Facebook, I think, is a really good example where Facebook have a ginormous monolith and they're really, really good at releasing frequently. But that doesn't mean that if you don't have a ginormous monolith, you should do it the way Facebook does, right? Like Facebook are doing great. They've got loads of great practices. But if you've got like a small microservice architecture, you don't need to do a lot of the complicated stuff that they have to do because they've got however many thousands and bazillions of engineers working on the same code base. So, you've got context is king, I guess.
Yeah, it looks like focus on the outcomes that you want to get and the principles that you want, and not exactly on the specific practices that other companies are doing. They might not make sense to you. So
Pete, I'd love to hear about people doing branching or not doing branching or doing trunk-based development or not. Yeah. I remember, so I did a couple of books on Subversion, right? So I'm dating myself in terms of, version control tooling. But I remember having to tell someone once, branches are not free. Right, like they cost you something in terms of maintaining them and so on. But I'm just curious, like, did any patterns arise around the use of branching or not?
Yeah, well, I mean, Mike, now that we've got Git, branches are in fact free.
Yes,
you're obviously a dinosaur. Subversion is, I don't even know what that is. I'm being facetious. It's worse. I think it's worse now.
Really,
because that kind of idea, which I was being mean and sarcastic about, that idea of like branches are free, is I think more prevalent because they are. Branching is super cheap. Merging is not, right? Like it's not the branch is great. Woo! Branching's not the hard part, and it never was, right? And Git definitely made branching easier, and to some extent made merging easier. But that's like a whole different series of podcasts, probably. So one of the things I think is really interesting around CD is the relationship with CI, right? So continuous delivery, continuous integration. So nowadays, again, a whole other podcast series about what does CI mean, because a lot of people would say it's Jenkins or Travis or Circle CI, it's in the name. And the kind of the curmudgeons that came up with the term would say like, no, CI is a practice. It's about kind of integrating on a daily basis. And so I've wondered for a while, like, do you need to do CI in order to do CD? Like, do you need to do, if you kind of define CI as I'm integrating my changes into a shared mainline once a day, at least once a day, do I need to do that in order to be practicing CD? And I had this kind of hypothesis that no, you can actually succeed with CD without doing true kind of CI in terms of merging all your stuff at least once a day. And kind of, at least from the companies I talked to, that was what I found, is most of them were doing branching. Most of them were doing some kind of flavor of GitHub flow-ish, kind of what I think a lot of people are quite familiar with, modern kind of like branch management, where you've got like master and then you've got feature branches, and you branch off of master, you do your work, you submit a pull request or a merge request, and then you land it on master, and then eventually you kind of deploy to production. Like, I think there's nuance and details in how people are doing that stuff, but a lot of the organizations I spoke to were doing some kind of version of that. A few of them were doing trunk-based development, and we're having a great deal of success with it. And in general, the ones doing trunk-based development, I would say were doing better in general with continuous delivery, and were able to release more frequently. They were getting to the point that they were getting to like single piece flow. So literally, I have a commit, I land a commit, I walk that maybe one line change all the way out to production, which is great. And very, like, I didn't hear anyone saying like, yeah, I wish we weren't doing that, or like we tried that and it didn't work. Like, everyone who's got to that point, I think they were happy they were there. But there were a bunch of organizations that had feature branches that were around for more than a day, so they technically weren't doing CI, but they were doing okay, and they were they had there was a very common theme of, we don't like long-lived feature branches. There was a common theme of, a few of the more kind of like well-established orgs, or orgs that had kind of a heritage that went back to before kind of CD practices, said, like, oh yeah, we've got a few teams that are still kind of like, they have like shared team integration branches or whatever. And there was this kind of universal thing of like, but we're really trying to get away from that. So there was this general thing of like, we don't like feature branches. We definitely don't like release branches and things like that. But there was also, it wasn't like, oh gosh, because we're doing feature branches, we can't do CD. There was a desire to keep them small. But interestingly, that desire was, I didn't hear that many people saying, we like to keep them less than a day. The trunk-based development people, the people who were succeeding with trunk-based development, were definitely doing CI, and they were very happy doing it. But the ones that weren't quite there were still quite happy, which I think was really interesting.
Curious whether any other kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, like a CD cliche, or a supposition about the way organizations work. Whether any of those things, did you prove anything true to yourself, or did you, or maybe more interestingly, did you disprove anything, or discover something that was a bit of a realization to you?
I think one of the things that was so there was a lot of stuff that was that reinforced kind of existing things that I would have believed. So yeah, like people doing trunk-based development were doing great. Generally were happier. A lot of this kind of standard practices that I've seen in general, people applying when they're trying to get to continuous delivery. So kind of branch by abstraction and feature flagging, all of those kind of techniques were definitely in play. I think I was surprised that there was actually less kind of focus on those branch by abstraction techniques than I would have guessed. And I think that was generally because I was a lot of times what I saw, not that much feature flagging going on. It was for younger kind of startup-y orgs that were quite happy to just be blasting out features all the time and didn't really feel like they needed to kind of like put that much control on like when a feature was rolled out. So that was a little bit of a surprise. I think what was interesting to me was, and that I didn't expect, was that almost all of the organizations that were really doing well had invested like a lot of time on like what I would call a custom delivery platform. So something on top of their CICD kind of infrastructure. So they were using Travis or Circle or Concourse or Jenkins, I'm sure a lot of Jenkins, to do kind of like the nuts and bolts of, a change happened in source control. I need to do some stuff now. Like I need to push my artifact somewhere. Like the nuts and bolts was being done in general by a CICD system, but there was this whole like layer of kind of stuff on top of that that no one was using open source tooling or vendor tooling or kind of no one was kind of borrowing or buying that. Everyone had kind of implemented custom tooling on top of that. It was interesting because various orgs had done the same thing, but for their organization, like various orgs had hand rolled basically the same kind of set of capabilities. So it kind of feels like there's a gap there around why are we all kind of like reinventing this wheel. But I'm not sure
the wheel's the same for everyone though, right?
Yeah.
Because like everyone has a different, regulatory process and the department down the corridor that you've got to satisfy in your process and all that kind of thing. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it is. And it's like everyone's fitting together a slightly different thing. Like, everyone's deploying to a different system or a different kind of set of systems. They've got a different tech stack. They've got, again, different regulatory things going on, different kind of SDLC is kind of their development process is kind of baked into the tooling. So yeah, it kind of like, I don't know, it feels on one hand that that's true, but then I feel like we've probably said that in the past about a bunch of other things where it's like, oh, all of the pipes are a slightly different shape. It's like, well, maybe if we just all agreed to make the pipes the same size or the same fittings, then you could kind of like raise the level of abstraction. I'm not sure.
And Pete, just to get a sense of the investment, and just to be clear, this is not a side project, right? So the companies who were having success on that made an intentional, strong investment in building that and making that available to the whole companies. Is that so?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like I think the companies that were still kind of struggling a little bit with really founding their mojo with CD, it was like a little bit of a side project, or it wasn't like an intentionally kind of like a thing that everyone had realized was like, oh, we're building a thing. But for the companies that were really cranking on this, it was like a full-on internal product. So it was a platform that was treated as a product. There were teams of people who worked full-time on building this product. I would like to think that there were kind of product managers or similar that were out there like talking to their customers, i.e. product delivery teams, and trying to figure out how to do better. Analytics around how much, how was adoption of this platform going, all of that kind of stuff. Now it was a big investment, which implies that it was valuable, right? Because if I'd have seen it at one or two places, then maybe they were just people were wasting their time on something that was fun to do. But for it to be just so like very consistent theme tells me that there was a lot of value in doing it, even though it was a lot of cost as well.
Cool. And one thing I'd like you did touch on that, but I'd love to explore that a little bit further. So you talked about different types of companies, different types of architectures. Is it so that you have seen high levels of maturity with new and old companies, small and big, different types of architecture? So is that because sometimes we get this myth that, oh, I am this kind of company, I have this kind of legacy of history, therefore I cannot get to a high level of maturity on continuous delivery. So what did you see related to this and that variability?
Yeah, that was interesting for me. I think probably in the back of my mind, and maybe this is partly because I'm based in San Francisco and I'm kind of, if I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid, then it's in the water. And this kind of like, I guess had this a little bit of an assumption that the startups would be doing like cool, avant-garde, like super sophisticated stuff. And maybe, the Midwestern kind of like, auto e-commerce thing would be kind of a little bit further behind. What I actually found was that there wasn't really that much of a kind of a correlation there. Like some of the people, some of the older, more established companies that were not in the Bay Area, were just in the middle of the country, were just quietly kicking butt. Basically, they were like, yeah, we don't really, most changes flow out to production within maybe a day of us starting them, and no, we don't really do branches anymore, and yeah, it's quite a simple system, so it's not that hard. I'm like, well, actually, yeah, you're doing really well. And it was almost like they didn't realize quite how well they were doing, which is a really good sign, right? Like if you're just kind of like quietly succeeding, sometimes you don't realize that that like the thing that you're doing is actually really successful. So yeah, that was interesting. That was definitely interesting to me. And I think when I reflect on it, I think part of the reason for that is because most of the time when you go to conferences and you like, who invests in an engineering blog because they're trying to recruit engineers? It's the Silicon Valley startups of the world. So they talk. You get these breathless posts about how I'll pick on Twitter from like 10 years ago because probably everyone involved is no longer involved in it. But like Twitter would like inventing how to do like a message bus in Rails.
Yeah.
And it was and
it nearly killed them.
Of fanfare,
it nearly killed them, right?
Yeah, like multiple times. They retried to do it like multiple times. And the amount of fanfare and excitement that was done around this, it wasn't the amount of hype that got was not was way more related to the amount of marketing that was involved than the actual kind of like quality or good idea-ness of the thing. And it's mean for me to pick on that specific example. Like the thing is, every organization does really dumb stuff, but like only in Silicon Valley are they so proud about it,
And how about the value aspect, Pete? So you did mention that companies who, going back to when we were discussing the definition of continuous delivery, so companies who had the ability to deploy frequently, usually leverage that and understood the value of that. Was that something? What have you found related to that? Are companies extracting value and business value out of this? Is this something the IT department is pushing and the rest of the company doesn't get it? So what do you see connected to that? So.
Yeah, that's interesting. The actual legit research. So I was talking about Accelerate and the DevOps research, DORA. I can't remember what the
agency
stands for, but there you go. Association agency. Nicole and those folks did actual science, which demonstrates that reducing software performance ties to organizational performance, and part of software performance is driven by kind of continuous delivery and these like practices of reducing batch size. So I think that I was not doing science. I was going and there's probably like a science word for like I wasn't really doing science, like it was a kind of experiential report or something. I was just going and talking to people about it and trying to understand what was going on. There was definitely an interesting correlation where the science says reducing batch size is a good thing, and all of these organizations had that feeling. And when they were slipping away from that and saying like, oh yeah, we're only reducing we had a period where we were only able to deploy every 2 days, it was kind of, they knew that was bad and they wanted to get back to like every day. So there was a kind of a sense. And I think, when I asked for a couple of those organizations, I kind of said like, well, why, why are you doing this? Like, what is the benefit? And what I heard was the kind of the standard stuff around, the biggest kind of thing I heard was around responsiveness to the needs of the business. So essentially, like we're able to we're able to deliver stuff back to the people that are asking for it fast enough that they stop yanking the wheel, right? Because like I've seen that where business people are like, we need blah, and every time I ask for it, it takes ages. So maybe if I ask harder, or if I ask more often, or if I like micromanage the crap out of it, then maybe that will work, right? So they're kind of like yanking the steering wheel and causing a bunch of noise. When I asked kind of people like, why, like what's the benefit, they kind of played that back to me around like, now we can we're able to kind of respond to the business fast enough that they're stopping kind of yanking the wheel and micromanaging us as much.
I mean, that's really interesting, Pete, because one of the questions you always kind of get about continuous delivery is, or one of the opposite arguments, I guess, is, well, I actually don't want to release features that often because I'm going to be changing it under the feet of the users all the time and people are going to get annoyed by that. Or you get sort of these arguments about non-consumer facing website businesses, right? That in theory can move slower and therefore wouldn't appreciate the smaller batch sizes. But what you're saying about, satisfying the business more often so that you can nudge the ship in the right direction rather than, trying to steer it hard to port, that's super interesting.
And I think, it's a universal thing that I think applies to almost everywhere. Maybe there's some exceptions around like systems that are in like almost 100% maintenance mode and are just not like being changed very, very infrequently. Then I could kind of maybe buy that the investment isn't worth it. But yeah, I think the fundamentals are like, if you can make small changes more frequently, then there's less cost and there's less friction. And it doesn't matter whether those small changes are like, it doesn't matter what the thing is that you're making the small changes to. It's just the kind of fundamental thing is you're reducing risk and, all of the kind of lean principles. And they apply like, not literally universally, but like they apply very, very broadly, I think. Like, for example, this is not related directly to the research I did for this book, but, a client of mine is a fintech company, and they have mobile apps, and the convention when I first started, one of the first projects I did at ThoughtWorks actually was for a big bank, and it was when the iPad had first come out, so it was a while ago. And the idea of releasing native apps frequently was crazy because you can't really do it. It doesn't make sense in our context, blah blah blah. And now even now this other fintech that I'm working for, they've moved to kind of weekly releases of their native apps, and they want to go faster, and that's not that crazy now. And it turns out that it's just as useful for them as it is for the web people, because it's the same fundamental kind of forces at work, whether you're deploying deploying to the App Store or deploying to Kubernetes. It's the same ideas.
So we're getting kind of closer to the end of the time here for today's podcast. I wonder, Pete, if you thought there were any kind of takeaways for people who are, thinking about CD. Maybe they're struggling, or maybe they're doing some CD and they want to check that they're following the principles that you think are the most important. Like what kinds of takeaways would you give from this research that you'd done?
I think that the fundamental thing is around reducing batch size and deploying more frequently. And what's interesting is what you should plan for. If that's your goal, what you should plan for is that act of deployment. You need to figure out how to scale that out, because if today you deploy once every 2 weeks, it's kind of possible to have that be, there's these 4 people that do the deployment. Even if it's even if they're the DevOps people in the team or something, that like that is feasible to do. If you want to get to the point that you're deploying, daily or more frequently than daily, then you've got to figure out how to scale that out. And the only way that almost universally, it's not almost universally, everyone I spoke to, the way they scale that out is by pushing it down into the individual product delivery teams. And the way that you do that is you build tooling, and you replace those 4 people who are able to do the deployment with, rather than them doing deployment, they're spending their time building the platform that lets them do the deployment. That lets the product engineers do kind of self-service deployment. And that's something that you should plan. If you want to succeed, you've got to get to that point eventually. You can get there incrementally, and maybe for first kind of start getting used to the ideas and speed up maybe automate the process a little bit, but it's still those 4 people that are running it, blah blah blah. Like, you don't go there in one go, but expect that at some point you've got to be able to have an engineer walking their change all the way to prod without bugging any kind of centralized people. And that's like a really big kind of cultural shift and big investment in tooling for some places. But I think it's like the only way that you can actually succeed with this kind of in a sustainable way.
And just want to echo something that you said earlier as well, which is that if you do build such a thing, a delivery platform for your organization, you need to be treating it as a product, having internal customers for it. You don't have a team in the corner who go and build it in an ivory tower, and then you have all the problems with this sort of building stuff in a vacuum kind of thing. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about building it the right way.
Yes, and that's actually my new obsession, is kind of like platform teams. Like, how do you succeed with platforms? Because I've just been unlucky, but I've been at so many places that have done that, where there's like a platform team who are like, we know, mostly it's like, mostly they're like, they tend to be picked from as the people that are good at this stuff, and they are picked because they're good at building software, not necessarily good at product management. And there tends to be this thing of like, oh, well, this, in my tiny little part of the org, the way we did it is X. All we need to do is like build the software for that and then hit people over the head until they start using our software. And if they don't use our software, that's their fault because we didn't hit them. Well, no, it's their fault. We were clearly hitting them.
So, and Pete, before we wrap up, tell us a little bit about the book. So what's the whole conversation has been about the book. I realize that, but what's in the book? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So it's basically summarizing these interviews. So I went and talked to these organizations and essentially asked them all to describe what's your path to production. Like how does a small feature change get through to your users' hands, and I tried to summarize, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, like what were the similarities, and what were the differences, and talk about things like branch management and code review, the stuff that we were talking about around kind of minimal branches, how people are doing code review, which is actually quite interesting, and then. Something we didn't talk about actually is these kind of patterns for testing to integrating your changes. So if you've got 5 teams that are all operating their own, or 20 teams that all own their own services, how do you check that your change is going to work well with all those other changes? So it's actually, that was interesting to me because there's just so many different ways that people are doing it. Really in a lot of different ways, and talk a lot about kind of deployment and this idea of the release bus idea and other ways that kind of people are succeeding with deploying monoliths, and some stuff around kind of like how feature flagging and decoupling deployment from release, and how do you kind of close that feedback loop around I made a change, like what's the impact of that change. And that was kind of interesting because that was interesting to me that a lot of organizations that are doing okay don't have that much sophistication there because they don't need it, which is an interesting thing to me. So yeah, it's talked all about stuff, and really the goal is for this to be real world, actual kind of like, it's at least working for one organization because they're succeeding. So yeah, and it's a free download, so doesn't cost you anything, and reasonably short read. So.
Okay, well, Pete Hodgson, thank you very much for joining us today. Where can people find you online if they're looking for you?
I think they should come and look for me because I love talking about this stuff. So if there's anything where you've disagreed heartily with what I've said or you want to ask more questions, come find me. I am PH1 on Twitter, and my website is thepete.net.
Well, it was a great conversation. Great to have you with us, and thank you very much for joining, and thank you all for listening. And if you have any feedback for us, don't hesitate to reach out or to leave a rating or comments on your preferred platform. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.